Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining Analytics Stories today. I'm excited to have my friend, colleague, and client, Bridget Sheahan, with us. Bridget, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So let's just jump in and we'll come back and do a few intros. So just to give me a quick, 60-second answer to this question, what's the one thing you heard that changed your view on analytics?
Well, actually, Lee, you taught me this, and I'll paraphrase it a bit, but why does this matter? So I think the way you taught us was, what would happen if we didn't answer this question? And I really try to coach my team on making sure they know why this is important to solve, right? So if they're getting asked to jump into a certain level of data or create a new analysis, what would happen if we didn't do this analysis for our client? And I learned that from you.
Wow, that's great. And that was not a setup. So
I know.
I'm as surprised as anybody to get that answer. So of course that makes me super happy to hear that something that has had such a good effect and lasting thought on you and the people that you work with, and hopefully your clients as well are the end recipients of that. So thank you for that.
Yep, we actually added it to our Salesforce ticket as a question that our sales team needs to complete before we'll even start working on their analysis. And usually they will write, "We'll lose lots of money," and then we go back to them and say, that's not an acceptable answer. Like this specific question you're trying to solve for, what would happen if we did not have the answer?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of that, is it really forces you to think. It doesn't, because everybody always wants to save money or make more money, right? Have better customer service. Those are the kind of key things you would always expect somebody to answer that question. So that's nice. I like that you added to the Salesforce ticket too. That's pretty good. That's nice. Bring the sales team into the process. So now that we're past that jump in question, and I'm sure that these things are going to come up as themes through the rest of our chat, let me just introduce Bridget to you now that you have gotten a little insight into her thinking. So she is the VP of Insights and Analytics at Valassis, which is a Vericast business. And she's got a long career in marketing and data across a lot of verticals, but especially in retail. And she's got some interesting passions outside of data and working with her teams, as you've heard. She's a mom of 2 teenage girls. So we've got the teenage girl thing in common, and we've talked about that quite a bit. She attempts to golf. She enjoys gardening, yoga, and is a triathlete. So, she's got the ability to really focus and prioritize. Anybody who puts that much energy into something like running a triathlon has really got some focus. So maybe that'll even come into play here. Anything you want to add before we get into the core of the conversation?
No, I think you covered that intro very well. Thanks.
Excellent. We're not going to talk about the teenage girls. That's definitely not.
No, that's not. That's for a different type of podcast, right?
Yeah, that's the beer podcast.
Right. Let's just say the past year or so has presented some interesting challenges in that area.
Yeah. Yes. I think I'll take your cue and leave it at that. All right. So let's talk about some data stuff here. So now, as you already brought up, that your work is really so client focused, and a big part of that is persuading them to take action, right? As it's one thing, as you said, to pull out of them, why is this important and what would happen if we weren't able to do this, but then actually getting them to do something is key. And one thing I see in that area is a lot of people think that you can just kind of lay the data out and then you expect the pieces to fall into place, right? Oh, they're going to see it. They're going to understand what to do, and no problem. They're going to go ahead and do exactly what we recommend. So if you could think about maybe, in a high stake situation, and I'm sure you've come across some of those where what you're doing is really even more critical than other things. What's one behavior that you think our listeners should be thinking about changing that will help them be more persuasive?
So the biggest challenge that I have with data scientists and data teams is that these are really intelligent folks that are combing through data, and they want to show you how they arrived at their conclusions. They want to convince you that their analysis is statistically sound, and they want to walk you through the steps of how they got to these conclusions. The challenge with that approach in a high stakes situation where you have a client on the other side of the table that might be a chief marketing officer or head of a marketing department is that they have a limited amount of time and a very high level understanding of the inner workings of the data. So I think the most impactful thing that you can do is to grab their attention right away. So you had Jim Cooper on here, I think, in one of your previous sessions, and he calls that the grab, the guts, and the gotcha, right? I think that was the way that he phrased that. And what I find that my team does is like they want to build up the story with all the component parts. The recommendations and the conclusions are the last slide in the presentation, and there's no summary to tell you, what's the most important. So we're really pivoting to let's get their attention up front. Let's have some very concrete conclusions, recommendations, and metrics out of the campaign on a summary sheet, and then we dig into how we got there, and then getting them, getting that buy-in. So if that key decision maker had to leave the meeting early, or maybe they couldn't even attend at all, and they're not going to flip through a 20-page deck to find out what your message is on slide 17, let's get that critical recommendation out of the way up front.
Yeah, and this is something I've struggled with on a lot of levels in presentations and other things, and I can offer, and I'm curious maybe why you think some of these things are happening. But I know as I'm an engineer by trade, but what that means is my brain works in a certain way. And analysts, I think their brains work in a certain way, and I think it tends to be more linear, because especially that's how you also go through some investigation, right? You had to start somewhere, maybe you had an hypothesis and you follow through and you go down different avenues, and some are dead ends and some you kind of keep tracking down. And then I think because of that, it's the way that we end up laying these things out. And as somebody, when I'm having been running my business, I've learned to kind of move away from that, and also running, doing analytics for clients at agencies, similar to what you're doing, is to give them that headline. And I always think back to even things like the National Enquirer, for people that might know that. And it was this magazine that was on the newsstand, and you'd see it when you're checking out, and they always had these outrageous headlines. But it was there to grab your attention, right? That's what they wanted. And I think that's, especially with short attention spans these days, and people are so distracted and there's so much going on, to be able to deliver a message like that is so much more important. And and I think it's a skill that's can be learned, but I think it's probably a little harder for analyst types. And I don't know if you've seen that or how you feel about that observation.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's the way the mind works. It's very linear, and there are steps involved in the process. And the team takes great pride in their work, as they should. So they put, their analysis through a lot of rigor, and they want to showcase how statistically sound this work is. And what I try to say to them in the most polite way possible is like, nobody cares. And what I mean by that is, in that meeting, the decision makers they might say, oh, what's the statistical significance of this regression analysis? Because, they know like a few catchphrases in statistics. But at the end of the day, it's not gonna move the needle on creating value for your client. How rigorous is this analysis? Now, that doesn't mean, if you are limited in data points, that you shouldn't, disclose that. But that's not what we lead with. Like, that's an appendix slide. Or if the client says, well, tell me a little bit about how you went through this process, what rigor was involved. We also want to keep it at a pretty high level. Like, knowing your audience is really key. And what I spend a lot of time with my team, not so much now, but when I first started leading analysts, is where I started to uncover this communication challenges is in their emails. So if they need something from me, I've trained them in an email. Well, email is not the best way. If they need something from me urgently, they know they should text me. But if they are emailing something out, put in the first 2 sentences why I should care about this email. Like need approval for feasibility exception for client X. Put that in the very first sentence. And then if you want to get into like, when I was running the analysis, I encountered that the store count was limited because of these reasons, and we think it's still feasible. Put all that afterwards so that I know, oh, this is something I need to take action on, and I can very quickly reply. And if I decide I want to know more, then I can learn more, but I don't have to read through 3 paragraphs to understand what it is that you're asking of me.
Right. Yeah, it's a good model, because it really follows that kind of, I'll say, template that they should have in mind, right? It's like, what, give me the catch my attention, give me the highlight, and then let me decide. It's almost like, we see everywhere TLDR, right? Too long, didn't read, kind of thing. And it's just the way we are these days. And I think part of it's just adapting to how people are able to respond to things like that. But I think that's good. Yeah. The other thing too, I mean, you mentioned, the who cares side of it. Part of it is, I've said to people, the person on the other end, whether it's an internal client, an external client, in most cases, it's table stakes that they expect that you actually know what you're doing, and that you're doing it a certain way, and you have a process, right? And so they get that, right? So explaining that to them, they're like kind of already there. So going through that detail with them, they're like, yeah, okay, I get it. You did your job, right? Now, what did you figure out that we need to really talk about here? Because I don't have a lot of time or interest, maybe even in that. But like you said, analysts like to, when you go into someone and they tell you about the software they built, they don't show you they don't go through the code and how they wrote the code, right? They're like, oh, you wrote the code, did it work? Oh, there's some bugs, okay, right? It's for some reason there's a thing about our community that we have to figure out how to move away from.
Yeah, and I think kind of following along on that, the other best practice that I have used with my team is to make sure that you have what I like to call a SNIFF test process with your data. So if you're leading with, let's say, sales lift from a campaign, and you go into a client and you say, during this campaign period, you had a 5% overall sales lift, and this product that you advertised had an 8% sales lift. And then everyone kind of looking at each other in the room, and they're like, we didn't have a 5% overall sales lift. Actually, our sales were down 1%. And then you lose all credibility, and anything that you say after that, they're going to question. Right. So what I coach my team on is we present to the marketing decision makers, right? And we use, it's either third-party data in the CPG world, which is readily available to purchase, or we will get data directly from clients. So POS data, sometimes household level data if that is captured. And what ends up happening is if you're pulling from disparate data sources and then you're rolling it up to like a total number, the sum of the parts doesn't always equal the whole. Maybe you have an incomplete data set. Maybe they left stores out. Maybe online sales are included in a different store number. And that data is coming from people who are not in the meeting when you're presenting it back. So it's coming from like a BI team or an analytics team at the client. So what I like to do is once we get the data, we've built a process in Ultrix actually, where the data is summarized, and it tells you this is your date range for the data. These are the number of unique stores. These are the total sales captured from your campaign period and whatever your pre-period is, and that implies an X% increase. And I will go back to the BI people at the client and say, overall, we're showing $10 million of sales during this time period, or a 5% increase. Does this pass your SNIFF test of what you know to be true about your results? And it has saved us so many times from that, that difficult meeting where your credibility is in question. Because look, what my team does, the campaign is already run. We're going back to clients and saying, this is how your campaign performed. These are the things that worked. These are the things that didn't work. If there's inaccuracy in the data, it's embarrassing, right? It doesn't cost Valassis any money. We don't have to do a make good to the client. It wasn't how the campaign was executed. It's like, oh, well, we made a mistake in this analysis, but it does cost us credibility and reputation and perhaps like that next campaign. But in the moment, it is embarrassing. So we have that process to have a SNIFF test, if you will, on the data.
Yeah, that makes sense to kind of check that and not make assumptions about it, or even when you think because you've worked with a client for a while, it doesn't hurt to ask for sure, and also brings them in to the process better, because maybe could be you're right and they did something wrong, or they're like, oh, we forgot to include a set of something from the data, or right, it might not just be the way you are managing it. So and you'll save yourself not only the embarrassment, but you'll save yourself a ton of time and money and energy, right, internally, because you're not analyzing the wrong data on top of everything else.
Yeah, that's more often the answer, is that the data pull was incorrect. And it's partly because like maybe something was lost in translation, or to my earlier point, like it wasn't the full chain. Maybe we were only looking at a certain number of stores, but really that like implementing that process has saved us a lot of energy and a ton of time, because that whole data cleansing process, we say, it takes about, I don't know, an hour maybe to run, but we give ourselves a few days of time in our process to look at it, get it back to the client, have it verified, and then it helps everyone along the way, because again, those internal teams that are pulling the data are different than the decision makers in that process.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good thing for people to realize. And I think, like you mentioned, the tools are getting better at this. So now actually this is a good, this next thing I want to talk to you about actually is got some good connections to some of the things you've just been mentioning. So you have a pretty sizable team of analysts, and I think there's personal and professional challenges that we all have as analysts and going through this kind of work that we've touched on. I wonder if you mentioned a little bit of this. Is there an area that you find yourself really continuing to mentor the team on, and why this is so important, in building the work that you do?
It's similar to the first answer I gave you of what does this mean. Mm-hmm. So when we're presenting to a client, we want to understand, what does this mean to the client? How can this help Valassis improve their relationship with this client? How can this information teach the client something about their business? What happens with my team is we execute on a measurement campaign. We present to the client, and then we're on to our next campaign to measure. So we use Jira to manage all of the process flows. So managing your Jira tickets, making sure they're getting closed out, the data's getting captured. And we don't allow for enough time in our day to take a step back and say, what did I learn here that I didn't know about this client or this particular data story, right? So was this an outlier? And if it was, a real significant outlier, I got to go back to that SNIFF test check, like, does this data make sense? Because normally I see a low single digit sales lift anytime we run this type of campaign, and this one was 15%. So let me make sure this is first correct. But if we do verify that it is correct, what does this mean for this client? Is there a bigger picture story? And then how can I leverage that learning across other clients in that vertical or across other verticals? So my team is aligned by vertical. We do the bulk of our work for CPG, and followed by retail and restaurant. And there are some synergies across those verticals that we can leverage when you look at things like sales lift and foot traffic impact. Less relevant for CPG, very relevant for restaurant and retail. And what I have to coach the team on is allowing for time there to take a step back and say, what does this mean? Instead of checking the box to say, okay, this one is complete. And then how that helps our client is if we're asking ourselves, what does this mean? Is this a change in trend? Did we learn something new? Then those learnings can impact the next campaign. But if we're head down delivering, these results, making a recommendation, and then we're moving on to the next measurement project, which may or may not be for the same client, we lose that continuity and closing that loop of key learnings. And I haven't cracked the code on how we get there. It's a lot of one-on-one coaching. It's a lot of meetings over Zoom to ask and keep asking the question of, why is this insightful? Is this important? And if we continue to get the answer of, oh, well, there's nothing really new here to report. We're doing 200 measurement studies for this client in a given year, and the trend is the same, and we're kind of running out of new insights, then that's an answer as well. Like, what value is this bringing to your client?
Keep doing the work.
If you can, right, and how are they using it? So really coaching my team to ask, our clients, how are you using this information to make different decisions? And I recently was part of the client initiated this, and I love it. I wish more clients would do this, but they had a comprehensive review, like, of our service. and analytics was a big part of it. And so I got invited, and my team, and they asked really pointed questions about some of our deliverables. Like in this example, it was audience insights. And it's something that we track, like, oh, if they consume this CPG product, they also go to these retailers or these restaurants. And the client feedback was like, these are all really interesting, but we're not sure how they're actionable, right? And so getting that feedback from the client, and then looking at the resources that it takes for my team to produce those type of insights, that we all kind of say like, oh, these are getting a bit tired. Maybe we need to refresh the data source. Maybe we need to refresh what are the insights attached to this data. It really helps us if we take the time to ask what does this mean? And if things aren't changing in the results, if we're not seeing different things happening when we change media or change creative, why do we think that that is happening? So that's what I spend a lot of time coaching my team on, is to just ask, is there a bigger picture story here? And it doesn't always have to be the case, but really questioning, like, what does this mean, and how do I create insights from this data?
Yeah, I like a lot of those points you brought up. One is that kind of issue of, is this something that we need to keep doing, or do you need to pause it, right? There's always this, well, it's there, we always have to do it, thinking, and sometimes there's never just, maybe we don't, or maybe we pause it, or something like that. So that's just a kind of I think a core thought process or evaluation to go through on any of this stuff. But you were making me think about the flip side. You said for the sales teams, you have them ask the client the question of, what is it that you're going to do with this, or what is it that's going to, kind of set the business back if you're not going to be able to have access to this information and insights. Doing the same for your team, and maybe with the client in some aspects too, which is, forcing them to answer that question, right? If the sales team has to do it in Salesforce, what's the mechanism on the flip side to say, you need to collect that information as part, the project doesn't end until then, right? Kind of a thing. So that's just more of a tactical thing. The bigger issue is what you brought up about that client review, which is about the actionable side. And I don't know specifically in the way you're working with clients, but I know a lot of teams that I'm working with, or things that I've seen, is when the project is delivered, you lose visibility into what happens in terms of what is the client actually doing now, and how are they internalizing it, and what things are they changing about their process or stuff. And so you don't have that complete end-to-end picture. The end is not maybe necessarily that deliverable that you're making. The end is, what did they do and what happened, right? So it's, okay, was it actionable, which is important, what action did they take? And then what happened because of that action? Was it something unexpected? Was it expected? Was it good? Was it bad, right? And then why, right? And the why could be things like, it just did better than we expected, or dumb luck, it just, we actually did our analysis wrong and we missed that there was an upside or a downside that we didn't anticipate, things like that. And easier said than done, for sure, in terms of getting that visibility. But I think that that's a way to, really engage a client, again, internal or external, however you're working with someone, and really closes the loop on the business, as a whole of that analytics cycle. So that's just something I would throw out there for everybody to think about from this kind of work.
Yep.
So let's kind of close this out. I've got one more thing I want to bring up with you. It's kind of more of a broader thought question. So I know that one of the things that your team has worked on is, like you said, the whole aspect of how do you present data and things like that, and kind of falls in this newer discussion topic of data literacy. It's something I think about a lot. And so I'd like you to imagine that you could invite your clients into, I'll say, the data literacy classroom. What would you call the lesson that you'd want to present to your clients? And what 3 things would you want them to learn?
So if it were my clients in the classroom, I would really go back to, how is this information going to create value for your organization? So the title of the class would be something like Data for Value Creation. Not data for data's sake because you have a team of analysts who can crunch some numbers for you, but data for value creation.
I like that.
And what I would want them to learn mainly is, what are the right questions to ask of the data scientists in front of you? So you mentioned earlier that a lot of what we do is just table stakes. And going too far down into the weeds about the methodology in a meeting like that, where you're trying to just understand what is the story and what are the insights, we do have clients who will take us there. And so I would want them to understand what questions to ask. And it's things like, okay, there was a 5% sales lift, and normally our benchmark is around 3%. Why do you think that happened? What does this mean? Was it our creative that was different? Is it the mix of media or the frequency of digital? What was different about this campaign that could explain the 5%? So really teaching our clients to ask different questions around the data. And where we sometimes land is down the rabbit hole of, well, what if we looked at the data this way? And what if we have a client, for example, who looks at new customers, existing customers, and lapsed customers, right? So they have definitions around what each of those are. But that data is not captured in their POS. That data is actually captured in their loyalty CRM, customer relationship management database, right? So we get data from the BI team out of POS. It has household level information attached to it, but it doesn't have those flags of, is this a new versus existing versus lapsed customer, because it's a longer period of data. And I might be new today, but tomorrow I'm existing. And so we've caught ourselves in conversations like that, where the client is insistent, like, well, I want to see what the sales lift was for new versus existing versus lapsed customers. And we could spend a half an hour talking about how we might, organize the data differently to be able to capture that information, and at what point. And then you look at your watch and you're like, well, we've just spent 35 of this 45 minutes getting down into the weeds of something that the BI team could handle, offline. So really focusing on what is important here, not what is every single thing that you could do with this data and every way that you could slice it. So helping us help them simplify the message to create value from our analysis.
Yeah, it's just so, it goes back to the, issue about people like us, of it's easy to want to talk about the data. It's the most natural aspect of what we do. And so and I'm not saying analysts are the only one, like anybody who that's their profession, it's easy to, like, everybody likes to talk about the thing that is, whether it's marketing or IT or, right, whatever. And we have to train ourselves to pull back from that. And I love the idea that, getting the clients to participate in that as well is a good education for them, because you're, I think, teaching them the idea of that data is the data. It's not the driver, even though we use things like data-driven decision-making and data-driven, right? It's really not the data. I mean, the data is there, but and I think so even the terminology kind of gets us in a little bit of a hole sometimes. So
yeah, and we have examples too where the decision maker at a client, like the CMO, for a lot of really good reasons, is not as familiar with the detail behind the data that's available. So we've been in front of CMOs before who are asking us for household level insights based on their POS data, and they don't have a loyalty program, or they're not collecting beyond the zip code. And it's not that they don't know that, but they're not as close to that detail. So to your earlier point, the data is the data. What is it that we can distill from it to create value for you? And then not getting so hung up on what's lacking early on in the conversation. Oh, well, we wanted this part of an analysis. We would like to see more detail, over here with new and lapsed customers. Being able to quickly table those. If they're not there, there's no way the analyst in the call can be like, oh yeah, let me just go run that for you now while you guys can talk amongst yourselves. That just can't happen. So just being able to pivot away from anything that we don't have available, or something new comes up, like, oh, I wonder if we looked at it this way. This is really interesting, and being able to say, let's take that as a follow-up. And then going back to the analytics team and getting the right data to make that happen.
You can work yourself down into the weeds so rapidly that your time just flies by because you're having so much fun talking about it, and then you realize that you've used it all up. Well, I think I want to wrap up there, because of course any of these parts of our discussion could. We could spend hours on all of them, but I think that some of the key points that you brought up here about, asking the right question up front and how that ties to value creation, and the idea of also focus, and I love the idea about doing it in the emails. It's a very kind of subtle, very ninja move on your part to, kind of seed that way of thinking and behaving. Is good. Kind of reminds me of like, Karate Kid, the wax on, wax off thing. And why am I doing this? And then all of a sudden, you see it come into play. So I like that one. Well, Bridget, of course, always good to see you. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And there were a ton of good ideas here that I think people can take and not just think about, but really start to work on for themselves. So, and hope to see you in person sometime.
I know, that would be great. If I could just close saying that folks can contact me on LinkedIn, and that we also have 2 current open positions for insights and strategy specialists. So analyst level roles, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. And we'd be happy to talk to anyone who was interested in learning more about this hands-on and learning how to write email from me.
Excellent.
Thank you, Lee.
All right. Thanks. Talk soon.
See ya. Bye.
Bye, everybody.